Unveiling of Hukuru Miskiy, the ancient mosque of Maldives with Cristiano Ronaldo. In the heart of the Maldives, amidst the azure waters of the Indian Ocean, lies a hidden gem that beckons travelers from around the world with its timeless beauty and rich history. Hukuru Miskiy, also known as the Old Friday Mosque, is a captivating testament to the Maldivian heritage and a place that promises not just a journey through history, but also a transformative experience. Join us as we embark on a thrilling voyage to explore the awe-inspiring Hukuru Miskiy and the enchanting wonders that surround it. Also, in this video, you can see very beautiful photos of Cristiano Ronaldo in the Maldives, which makes this trip even more enjoyable. Hello my dear friends, welcome to the Tourism with Setarehdan. I am Setarehdan, and in this channel I plan to introduce you to the amazing places and tourist attractions of the world. If you subscribe to this channel, you will travel with me to all the places of interest in the world, and you will enjoy your unique travels immensely. A glimpse into Hukuru Miskiy's rich history. Hukuru Miskiy, located in the capital city of Malé, is a jewel that has withstood the test of time for over 350 years. Built in 1658 during the reign of Sultan Ibrahim Iskandar Tafan, this mosque is a living testament to the skill and craftsmanship of Maldivian artisans. Its intricate coral stone structure is a captivating blend of Islamic and Maldivian architectural styles, showcasing the nation's unique cultural heritage. The name Hukuru Miskiy translates to Friday Mosque, highlighting its significance as a place of worship for the Muslim community in the Maldives. As you step inside, you are greeted by the peaceful atmosphere that has embraced generations of devotees. The mosque's interior is adorned with beautiful wood carvings, intricate lacquer work, and Quranic inscriptions, creating a mesmerizing ambiance that transcends time. The geographic allure of Hukuru Miskiy. Hukuru Miskiy is situated in the heart of Malé, the bustling capital of the Maldives. The city, which is perched on a coral island, offers breathtaking views of the surrounding turquoise waters. It's a destination that effortlessly blends modernity with tradition, making it a unique experience for travelers. Surrounded by the Indian Ocean, Malé is a paradise for water enthusiasts. The city boasts pristine white sand beaches, perfect for lounging under the sun or taking a dip in the crystal clear waters. Snorkeling and diving enthusiasts will find a treasure trove of marine life in the nearby coral reefs, making it a must-visit destination for those seeking underwater adventures. Delightful accommodations and dining. To fully immerse yourself in the allure of Hukuru Miskiy, it's essential to find the perfect base for your stay. Fortunately, Malé offers an array of luxurious and charming hotels that cater to all tastes and preferences. One such gem is the Kurumba Maldives, a lush and serene resort located just a short boat ride away from Hukuru Miskiy. With its overwater bungalows, pristine beaches, and world-class amenities, Kurumba Maldives is the epitome of luxury and paradise. It's the ideal retreat for those looking to relax in style after exploring the historic mosque. For food enthusiasts, Malé is a culinary delight. The city boasts an array of restaurants that serve both local Maldivian delicacies and international cuisine. Be sure to try traditional dishes like mashuni, a coconut and fish mixture, and roshi, a type of flatbread, at local eateries. Additionally, you can savor delectable international dishes at upscale restaurants like the Sea House Maldives, offering stunning views of the Indian Ocean while you dine. Beyond Hukuru Miskiy, exploring nearby attractions. While Hukuru Miskiy is undoubtedly the crown jewel of Malé, there are numerous other attractions waiting to be discovered in this vibrant city. 1. Malé Fish Market. Dive into the local culture by visiting the bustling fish market, where you can witness the daily catch and the vibrant energy of the Maldivian fishing industry. 2. The National Museum. Immerse yourself in Maldivian history and culture by exploring the National Museum, home to a fascinating collection of artifacts, including ancient royal thrones and historic documents. 3. Artificial Beach. Enjoy some leisure time at the Artificial Beach, a popular spot for swimming and water sports, as well as cultural events and festivals. 4. Vilingili Island. Take a short ferry ride to Vilingili Island, known for its serene beaches and lush greenery. It's the perfect spot for a relaxing day trip. 5. Malé Hulhumalé Bridge. Marvel at the engineering feat of the Malé Hulhumalé Bridge, connecting the capital city to the neighboring Hulhumalé Island. In conclusion, Hukuru Miskiy stands as a testament to the rich history and cultural heritage of the Maldives. Its timeless beauty and architectural splendor, coupled with the vibrant surroundings of Malé, make it an enchanting destination for travelers seeking a unique and transformative experience. So, pack your bags, set sail to the Maldives, and let the ancient whispers of Hukuru Miskiy lead you on a journey of discovery and inspiration. Your adventure awaits. At this moment, I invite you to see the very beautiful photos of Cristiano Ronaldo in a paradise called Maldives. If you enjoyed this trip and this video was interesting and useful for you, please click the like button to support us and write your opinion in the comments section. Also, share the link of this video with your friends and let them join our thrilling journeys. Join us on an exhilarating voyage as we guide you to the captivating allure of Sentosa Merlion, standing majestically on the shores of Singapore. Prepare to be enchanted by the mythical charm of this iconic creature, a symbol of the island's rich maritime legacy. Marvel at the panoramic views of the cityscape and the sparkling seas as the Sentosa Merlion takes you on a visual odyssey, offering a spectacular glimpse into the beauty of Singapore. As we explore the intricate details of this legendary creature, our journey extends beyond the majestic statue. In the upcoming video, we'll introduce you to the enchanting world of Stephanie Sun, Singapore's celebrated music sensation. Immerse yourself in the melodic brilliance of Stephanie Sun, whose captivating voice has garnered global acclaim in the realm of Mandopop. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to be the first to witness this extraordinary fusion of cultural marvel and musical excellence. And I also recommend that you watch this video about Angkor Wat in Cambodia if you haven't seen it yet, because the beauty of Angkor Wat will enchant you.